Well, the US has formally recognised Syria's rebel coalition as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Now, this upgrade in status was announced by the US President in a TV interview.
We've made a decision that the Syrian opposition coalition is now inclusive enough, is reflective and representative enough of the Syrian population that we consider them the legitimate representative of the Syrian people in opposition to the Assad regime.
President Obama has said the US does not support extremist elements of the opposition linked to al-Qaeda, and he said that America expects the mainstream parties to commit themselves to a political transition which respects the rights of women and minorities. Well, for more on this, let's speak with Adam Lockyer. He's a lecturer in US politics and foreign policy at Sydney University's US Studies Centre. He joins me live in the studio now. Dr. Adam Lockyer, good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Scott.
We just heard the President explain why they've made this acknowledgement. From your perspective, why do you believe now is the time that President Obama has recognised this coalition?
Well, it was expected to be announced tomorrow. There's going to be a meeting in Morocco tomorrow to support the Syrian opposition, and Hillary Clinton was going to go to Morocco, and it was expected she was going to make the announcement then. However, she's ill, and so Barack Obama's made the announcement today instead.
Now, this coalition is still a young and fairly disparate group that's been drawn together. So how risky is this for the Obama administration?
It is quite risky, and this is why it's been delayed so long. So many other NATO allies have already supported the Syrian opposition. So Turkey, Germany, France, Britain, they've all come out earlier and said they support and they recognise the Syrian opposition as the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people. The reason why the Americans have taken so long is because it is quite risky, because the opposition has many factions. Many of these factions are quite radical, militant, and so by supporting the Syrian opposition, it is a risky strategy because you don't know what's going to happen the day after Assad falls.
How can you say this coalition is the legitimate representative of the people and then qualify that by saying, well, some of those within this group are actually not seen as legitimate by us? Any of those that are extremist or linked to al-Qaeda, we don't see those as legitimate, but this is nonetheless the legitimate group. There's a lot of qualification there.
Absolutely, and this is part of the strategy. The part of the strategy is, well, what happens the day after Assad falls? And so what the Americans are trying to do is throw some political weight, some political support against the more moderate, the more secular, the more liberal elements of the Syrian opposition, while trying to put the more militant parts of the opposition out into the wings and try to separate them from the mainstream.
How risky is that it might create fractures and fissures within that coalition to create greater internal tensions at a time when it's not needed? It
already exists. So I think that the factions sort of dislike each other only slightly less than they dislike the Assad regime. And we've already seen this. In Aleppo, the Kurdish faction has come out fighting against some of the more mainstream factions. So they're already starting to throw shots at each other, which is very concerning to international audience, particularly the United States, who really don't want to become involved in the post-conflict reconstruction of the country and trying to put together this opposition into some sort of government at the end of this conflict.
Beyond throwing political weight behind this coalition, behind the opposition, how likely is it that this announcement is some kind of precursor for Washington to take a more active role in the transition to see the overthrow of the Assad regime?
Well, it does help in the domestic politics as well. So if the White House now wants to throw more support behind the Syrian opposition, they can now go to Congress and say, well, we've already recognised the Syrian opposition as legitimate, and when the Congress are then going to throw up their hands and say, well, what about the radical factions involved with the opposition, they can say, well, we're not supporting them. We've already listed these, the al-Nusra Front, as terrorists. We're not going to support them at all. However, if we're going to throw more humanitarian support, more non-military support behind the Syrian opposition, we can now do this, and hopefully that's an easy sell to Congress.
non-military support. What about military support? Condoleezza Rice, George W. Bush's Secretary of State, wrote a few days ago about not only that the US should back this coalition, which has now come to pass, but they should also vet and arm, I'm quoting her here, vet and arm the unified group with defensive weapons on the condition it pursues an inclusive post-Assad framework. Two things there. Vetting and arming this group. What's the likelihood of that? What are the risks involved?
I think that's quite unlikely at this stage. Obama thinks his two greatest achievements of his first term has been the successful withdrawal of American troops from Iraq and the beginning of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. The last thing he wants is to get US troops back into a large Middle Eastern country. That could really ruin his second term, his foreign policy. So the last thing he wants is to be sucked into the Syrian conflict. So I think that you'll see a lot of American support behind the Syrian opposition, everything short of direct military intervention and probably short of military support as well. So you'll see humanitarian support, you'll see non-military support like communications, you might even see a bit of training on the Turkish side of the border, but I doubt you'll see direct military intervention.
On the last point that Ms. Rice, Dr. Rice raises there, that if there is any sort of help of that nature, it should be on the condition it pursues an inclusive post-Assad framework, given all that you were saying before about the fractures that are already there, the uncertainties about what the post-Assad landscape will look like in Syria. How on earth could you expect that kind of condition?
Well, you can't. And so this is the major problem here. With the factions that represent the Syrian opposition, we don't really know what's going to happen the day after the Assad regime falls. And so when the Barack Obama administration came out and they declared the al-Nusra Front as a terrorist organisation, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, which is a more mainstream political wing, came out in support of al-Nusra. They said that these guys are very good fighters and they're a legitimate part of the Syrian opposition. And so we've already seen great splits and great cleavages within the Syrian opposition, and so this is a great concern to the Americans.
Finally, there is one rather large elephant in the room here when President Obama talks about this being the legitimate representative of the Syrians. Bashar al-Assad is still there in the presidential palace, and many Syrians still see him as their legitimate leader.
Oh, they do. But increasingly as time goes on, it's difficult to see how the Assad regime can survive. They can hold out, but they can't survive. And we can see that Assad is probably already starting to look at alternate options, either going into exile or trying to come to some sort of a negotiated solution to the conflict, because they can hold out, but it's difficult to see how they can win from this stage.
Dr. Adam Lockyer from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, always good to speak with you. Thanks so much for your time.